The terrace faced east. This was the first thing Cecily had noted about Stoneleigh Court when she arrived in the last week of April. Not the grandeur of the entrance hall, not the formal gardens that swept south toward the lake, not even the library, which was the finest private collection she had seen in her 23 years. It was the terrace. Specifically, the way it faced east, and the way the stone balustrade caught the earliest light before anything else on the property had been touched by it, and the way the air at that hour was still cold enough to feel deliberate, as though the morning had not yet committed to warmth and was still considering its options. She had come to Stoneleigh Court in the capacity of companion to Lady Maud Ashworth, her father's elder sister, who required a companion in the way that certain women require an audience, constantly, and with the specific expectation that the audience would remain attentive without ever becoming interesting itself. Cecily had been performing this function for 14 months. She was, by now, competent at it. She had also, in those 14 months, established one inviolable practice. She rose at 5. Not because she was required to. Lady Maud did not surface before 9, and Georgiana, Lady Maud's daughter, had been known to remain abed until noon, without apology. Not because the household expected it. Because the hour between 5 and 6 in the morning was the only hour in the day that Cecily could be reasonably certain belonged entirely to herself, and she had learned, over the course of a life that had provided her with very little that was entirely her own, to guard such hours with quiet ferocity. She dressed without the maid. She had always dressed without the maid. She had not had a maid of her own since her father's estate was settled 4 years ago, and she had relearned self-sufficiency with the pragmatic speed of a woman who understands that grief is a luxury and adaptation is not. She pinned her hair simply, took her shawl from the chair where she had laid it the night before, and went downstairs through the servants' passages, which were quieter than the main corridors and did not require her to explain herself to anyone she might encounter. The terrace door was never locked before 6. She had established this on her 3rd morning, and had relied on it since. The air outside hit her as it always did, cold and clean and faintly scented with the dew that still lay on the stone flags, and beneath that the smell of the rose beds that ran along the south wall, not yet in bloom but preparing themselves with the focused intent of things that know their season is coming. She pulled her shawl tighter and went to her usual place, the eastern end of the balustrade, where the stone was widest, and she could rest her forearms on it and look out at the park as the light came in. She had been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes on the morning of the 14th of May, when she heard the door behind her open. She did not turn. She had learned, carefully, over years, not to turn at every sound, not to make her attention available to whoever might be entering a space she occupied. She kept her eyes on the park, and waited to see whether whoever it was would speak or go. He did neither immediately. He came to stand at the balustrade, not at her end, but at the western end, perhaps 15 feet away, and he looked out at the park with the manner of someone who had also come here for reasons of his own, and had not expected to find it occupied. After a moment he said, without looking at her, "I beg your pardon. I didn't know anyone else was up." "Nor did I," she said. A pause. "I'll go," he said. "You needn't." She did not look at him, either. "The terrace is large enough." He stayed. They stood at their respective ends of the balustrade and watched the light come in over the park, the way it moved first across the upper branches of the elm trees at the far boundary, then down through the canopy, then across the grass in a slow advance that had something inevitable about it, the way all slow advances do in retrospect. The rooks in the elms made their morning complaint and then settled. A deer appeared at the park's edge, stood perfectly still for 30 seconds, and disappeared back into the tree line. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. After perhaps 20 minutes, the house behind them began to produce the first sounds of morning. A door, somewhere in the servants' wing, a distant clattering that was probably the kitchen. Cecily straightened from the balustrade. "Good morning," she said, to the park rather than to him, and went back inside. She did not know his name. She had not asked. He was there the next morning. She noticed this with the part of her mind that noticed things automatically, the same part that tracked the weather and the state of Lady Maud's temper and the exact volume of wine left in the drawing-room decanter. She noticed it, filed it, and went to her end of the balustrade. He was at his end. He had a cup of something. Coffee, she thought, from the smell that reached her on the light morning breeze. He looked out at the park. She looked out at the park. After perhaps 5 minutes, he said. It rained in the night. Yes. She could see it in the grass, the particular darkness of wet soil, the way the park held the light differently after rain. The roses will be better for it. Do you know roses? My mother did. A pause. Some of it is retained. He said nothing further. Neither did she. When the house began to stir, she went inside. He remained at the balustrade. She still did not know his name. She learned it, eventually, not from him, but from Georgiana, who mentioned it at luncheon on the third day, with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for handsome men and new arrivals. Mr. Ashton is staying the week, Georgiana said, dissecting her fish with the focused energy of someone whose attention was elsewhere. Papa's man in London sent him to look at the Northfield boundaries, something about the Ravenshaw estate's claim on the drainage. She looked up. He has very good hands, Georgiana, said Lady Maud. I only mean they are well kept for a man who works outdoors. Georgiana returned to her fish. He is not unpleasant to look at either. Rather quiet, though. He said perhaps 8 words at dinner last night, and 4 of them were thank you. Cecily ate her luncheon and said nothing. Mr. Ashton. The name fitted him, she thought, in the way that plain names fit certain people, unobtrusively, without pretension, belonging without claiming. She wondered if it was his real name. She did not know why she wondered this. There was nothing in their 2 mornings on the terrace to suggest it wasn't. He had behaved with perfect ordinariness, said ordinary things, maintained ordinary distances, given no indication of anything other than what Georgiana had described, a man of business, sent from London, concerned with drainage boundaries. And yet, she put the thought away and finished her luncheon and went to read to Lady Maud for the afternoon, which was her function, and she performed it without thinking about the terrace or the name that may or may not have been his. He was there the 4th morning and the 5th. By the 5th morning she had stopped noting it as a variable. His presence at the western end of the balustrade had settled into the category of fixed conditions, like the direction the light came from and the behavior of the rooks and the way the dew always lay thickest on the flagstones nearest the rose beds. It was simply part of the hour. They had developed, without discussing it, a set of understandings. He came to the western end, she came to the eastern. Neither encroached. The silence between them was not the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who had independently determined that the hour did not require speech to be worthwhile, and had arrived at this determination separately and then discovered, without surprise, that the other person had arrived at the same place. Occasionally one of them said something, never much. The economy of their exchanges was not unfriendliness, but precision. Neither of them wasted words, and in this they were, she thought, unusually matched. On the 6th morning he said, "There's a heron." She looked. There was, in fact, a heron, standing at the edge of the ornamental pond at the park's near boundary with the concentrated stillness of a creature that has committed entirely to a single purpose. She watched it for a moment. "He comes most mornings," she said. "Earlier than this, usually. You've been watching him." "I've been watching everything." She looked back at the park. "There is a great deal to watch at this hour." A pause. Then, from the western end, "Yes, there is." She did not look at him when he said this. She was fairly certain, in the way she was certain about things she did not examine directly, that he was not looking at the heron. On the 7th morning it was cold enough for breath to be visible, which surprised her. It was nearly the end of May, and she had not expected it, and she had come out with her heavier shawl and her hands wrapped around the small cup of tea she had taken from the kitchen, which was not her usual practice, but which the cold had made necessary. He was already there. This was unusual. She was generally first. She did not remark on it. She went to her end of the balustrade, and set her cup on the stone and looked out at the park, which was furred with a light mist that sat just above the grass and made the elm trees at the far boundary look like something from a painting, imprecise at the edges, more suggested than stated. "You're earlier than usual," she said. "I couldn't sleep." She accepted this. She understood not sleeping. She had spent a significant portion of her 23rd year not sleeping, in the months after her father's estate was settled, and she had understood, fully and finally, what her situation was. Not sleeping was something she knew the shape of. "The mist is good this morning," she offered. "Yes." A pause. "Do you always find something good about it?" She considered the question seriously, which was her habit with questions that deserved it. "I find it useful to," she said, "whether or not I always manage it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is an honest answer. I try to give those. Most people don't. Most people," she said, "have more to lose by it." She heard, or thought she heard, something that might have been the beginning of a response, considered and then set aside. She did not push. She had learned that some responses needed more space than the moment allowed, and that the ones worth having usually arrived, eventually, in their own time and on their own terms. They stood in the mist and drank their respective hot things and watched the park emerge from the morning, and when the kitchen sounds began behind them, she went in without ceremony, as she always did. She thought about his answer for the rest of the morning. Most people don't. He had said it without bitterness, but not without knowledge. It was the statement of a man who had been given dishonest answers enough times to have formed a general theory about the practice. She wondered what he was looking for, under the cover of drainage boundaries and Ravenshaw estate claims. She wondered, also, what he saw when he looked at her across the 15 feet of balustrade that separated them. She did not let herself wonder this for very long. It was not a productive direction, and she was, above most things, a practical woman. Georgiana cornered her that afternoon in the small sitting room where Cecily did the household mending, a task that was not, strictly speaking, part of her duties as companion, but which she had absorbed into her routine, because it needed doing, and because having something in her hands helped her think. "You've spoken to him," Georgiana said. Not an accusation, an observation, delivered with the specific quality of attention Georgiana reserved for things she found genuinely interesting, which was a shorter list than people assumed. "We have exchanged a few words." Cecily did not look up from the hem she was reattaching. "At breakfast? I didn't see you at breakfast." "Not at breakfast." Georgiana sat down across from her with the unhurried ease of a woman who understood that she had time and intended to use it. "Where, then?" Cecily set down her work. She looked at her cousin, at the copper hair and the green eyes and the expression of entirely genuine curiosity that was, she had always thought, Georgiana's most attractive quality, the quality that existed underneath the performance of beauty and the performance of eligibility and the performance of being Lady Maud's daughter. "On the terrace," she said. "In the mornings. He goes to the terrace in the mornings. He has been, yes." Georgiana was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. She was considering something. "What do you talk about?" she said. "Very little." Cecily picked up the hem again. "The weather. The park. A heron. A heron. There is one. At the ornamental pond." Georgiana looked at her with an expression Cecily could not immediately categorize, which was also unusual. "Cecily," she said, after a moment. "Yes." He asked Mottram which of the ladies in the house rose early. Cecily's hands stilled on the fabric. Mottram was the butler. He was also, as everyone in the household knew, entirely loyal to Lady Maud and constitutionally incapable of discretion. "When?" she said. "2 days ago." Georgiana was watching her carefully. "Mottram told Mama, of course." "Mama didn't mention it to you because—" She stopped. "Because it didn't occur to her that it might be relevant to me," Cecily said. Her voice was level. She had a great deal of practice at keeping her voice level. "Yes." Georgiana paused. "I thought you should know." Cecily looked at the hem in her hands. She thought about the morning he had been there before her. She thought about "I couldn't sleep," said in the flat voice of a man who was stating a fact and not the fact he meant. she thought. He asked. She filed this very carefully and did not take it out again for the rest of the afternoon. The 8th morning, she arrived to find him already there, and he had brought 2 cups. One was at his end of the balustrade. One was at hers, set precisely on the wide stone ledge where she habitually placed her own cup, as though it had always been there, as though this were a thing that had been established rather than invented. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was looking at the park with the studied attention of a man who has done something and is waiting to see what it costs him. The kitchen was already warm, he said. It seemed wasteful not to. She came to her end of the balustrade. She picked up the cup. It was tea, not coffee, which was what he drank, and it had been made correctly, which meant someone had told him how she took it, or he had paid enough attention to determine it himself, and she did not know which of these possibilities she found more difficult to account for. She drank it and said nothing and looked at the park. "Thank you," she said, after a moment. "It's only tea," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." But it was not only tea, and they both understood this, and neither of them said so, and the morning proceeded in the usual way, except that it was nothing like the usual way at all. She began, over the following days, to pay a different kind of attention. Not the attention she had been paying, the careful, cataloguing attention of a woman who reads rooms professionally and has learned to extract information from the smallest available data. That attention she had been paying from the beginning. This was something else. Something more like the attention you pay to a text you have read before and are reading again, knowing now that there are things in it you missed the first time. His hands, for instance. Georgiana had mentioned his hands, well kept for a man who works outdoors, and Cecily had registered this and filed it away. Looking now, she understood what Georgiana had meant, and also why it had bothered her in a way she hadn't examined. His hands were not the hands of a man who worked outdoors. They were not soft, there was nothing soft about them, but they were the hands of someone whose outdoor work was chosen rather than required. The difference was subtle. It was the difference between a man who had spent years in all weather because his livelihood depended on it, and a man who rode and walked and maintained an estate because it was his estate to maintain. His bearing, also. She had noticed this before, and not quite known what to do with the noticing. He stood at the balustrade the way men stand when they own what they are standing at, or when they are accustomed to owning things of a similar or greater value. It was not arrogance. She had seen arrogance and it looked nothing like this. It was something quieter than arrogance, a settled quality. The quality of a man for whom the question of whether he belongs somewhere has not been a live question for a very long time. And his silences were the silences of someone who is accustomed to being waited for. Not self-importantly. He did not perform the pauses, did not use them to demand attention. But they had a different weight than most people's silences. Most people's silences were empty. His were full. When he did not speak, the absence had presence. She assembled these observations over several mornings and regarded them without arriving at a conclusion she was willing to commit to. She thought, there is a difference between what this man is and what he says he is. She did not think beyond this. She was not sure she wanted to. On the 11th morning, it rained. Not the light rain that apologizes for itself and stops before it has committed, a real rain, coming in from the north with the flat determination of weather that has made up its mind. She heard it before she was fully awake, and lay in the grey pre-dawn light, listening to it against her window, and understood that the terrace would be unusable. She stayed in bed until 5 anyway. Then she got up anyway. Then she put on her shawl anyway and went downstairs. She stood at the terrace door and looked at the rain and did not go out. After a moment she heard a step behind her. She did not turn. She knew, without knowing how she knew, except that she had been paying the different kind of attention for several days now, and it had made her more accurate. She knew who it was before she heard him stop beside her. He was looking at the rain. "Not this morning," he said. "No." She kept her eyes on the terrace, on the rain moving across the stone flags in shifting grey curtains, on the rose beds at the south wall, bending slightly in the wind. "I came anyway." "So did I." They stood at the door and watched the rain. The terrace was perhaps 6 feet away, close enough to see clearly, far enough to be entirely wet in a matter of seconds. "There's a sitting room," she said, "off the east corridor. It faces the park." A pause. "I know," he said. She turned and looked at him then, for the first time this morning, turned fully, the way she usually did not on the terrace, where they maintained their separate ends and their careful lateral attention. She looked at him directly. He was already looking at her. He had, she thought, the most contained face she had encountered in recent memory. Not unexpressive. There was expression there, and it was not small, but it was managed with a precision that spoke of long practice, the way her own face was managed, the way you learn to manage a face when you have understood that what it does, without your permission, is information you cannot afford to give away. What she saw in it now, in the unguarded half-second before his expression adjusted, was something she recognized. He had been here before she arrived. He had been waiting to see if she would come. "The east sitting room," she said carefully, "has a good view of the park." "Yes," he said, "I imagine it does." She turned from the door and walked toward the east corridor and heard, after a moment, his footsteps follow her. The east sitting room was small and largely forgotten. This was its primary virtue, as far as Cecily was concerned. It had been furnished in the previous decade with pieces that were perfectly good and entirely out of fashion, and Lady Maud had therefore stopped using it, and no one had thought to repurpose it, because rooms that are not used by Lady Maud tend to become rooms that are not used by anyone, the household arranging itself around her preferences the way water arranges itself around stone. Cecily had found it in her first week at Stoneleigh Court and had quietly established it as hers in the same way she had established the terrace, by being there consistently enough that the room began to feel it had an occupant. She lit the lamp on the side table. Outside, the rain pressed against the east-facing windows with the satisfaction of weather that knows it has won the morning. He came in behind her and looked at the room with the assessing attention he brought to everything, cataloguing it, she thought, the way he catalogued the drainage boundaries and the field measurements, taking inventory. "You know this room," he said. It was not a question. "I come here sometimes." She sat in the chair nearest the window, her chair, the one with the slightly worn armrest that she had never thought about but which had apparently shaped itself to the angle of her elbow. "When the library is occupied." "Is the library often occupied?" "Georgiana uses it occasionally, when she is writing letters and wishes to feel literary." She folded her hands in her lap. "It passes." He sat down across from her, in the chair that faced the window rather than the one that faced the door. She noticed this, the choice of the view over the exit, and filed it alongside the other things she had been filing. "You grew up in Yorkshire," he said. "No, Shropshire." She looked at the rain on the glass. "My father's estate was there. We came to Stoneleigh for summers, sometimes, when I was young. My father and Lord Ashworth were friends." She paused. "Lord Ashworth has been dead 6 years. It is Lady Maud's house now, and you came to it when there was nowhere else particularly logical to go." She kept her voice level. "Lady Maud offered a position. It was a generous offer." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him, in the quality of the silence, considering whether to say what he was thinking. "Was it?" he said. She looked at him. "It provided a roof," she said, "and meals, and the occasional afternoon in a forgotten sitting room when it rains." "By some measures, yes." Something in his face, brief, controlled. "By other measures?" "By other measures," she said, "it is an arrangement that suits Lady Maud considerably better than it suits me, and we are both aware of this, and we do not discuss it, and it functions." She paused. "That is also a kind of generosity, I suppose, the not discussing." He looked at her with the full quality of his attention, the attention she had come to recognize over 11 mornings as his most honest mode, the one that appeared when he had stopped managing the surface of his expression and was simply looking. "You are very direct," he said. "You asked a direct question. Most people would have answered it differently." "Most people," she said, "have not been a poor relation for 3 years. It clarifies one's relationship with pretense." She looked back at the rain. I find I have very little appetite for it. I know something of that, he said, quietly. The appetite for pretense, or the loss of it. She turned to look at him again, because there had been something in his voice, not much, just the fractional shift that she had learned to catch, the almost imperceptible change of register that meant he was saying something he meant more than the words themselves conveyed. He was looking at the rain, she said. Mr. Ashton. Yes. What are you actually doing at Stoneleigh Court? The silence before his answer was longer than usual. Boundary assessment, he said. As I said, yes. She kept her voice neutral. And is that all? He did not answer immediately. He looked at the rain with the focused attention of a man who is buying himself time, and she let him buy it, because she had learned that some answers needed the full length of their silence before they could be given. No, he said finally. It is not quite all. She held still. There are matters. He stopped, began again. There are matters connected to the Ravenshaw estate that require some personal assessment, that go beyond the boundaries. What kind of matters? He looked at her. The expression on his face was the most unguarded she had seen it. Not open, not yet, but with less management than usual, as though the rain and the small forgotten room and the 11 mornings on the terrace had collectively loosened something he usually kept tighter. The kind, he said, that I am not yet in a position to speak about plainly. She looked at him steadily. Are they the kind that would change what I think of these mornings? Something moved through his expression, swift, complicated. I hope not, he said. I genuinely hope not. She received this. She sat with it in the way she sat with things she did not yet know what to do with, carefully, without pressure, letting it take the shape it would take in its own time. Very well, she said. You are not going to ask further. I am going to ask further, she said. Eventually, when you are in a position to answer plainly. She looked back at the rain. I have found, in my experience, that some information arrives in its own time, regardless of whether one pushes for it. Pushing tends only to make the information arrive poorly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how did you come to be so? He stopped. So what? She said. I was going to say measured. A pause. But that is not quite the right word. What is the right word? He considered. Exact, he said. You are exact, in what you say and what you choose not to say, and what you choose to wait for. Another pause. It is, he stopped again. It is, she prompted, the almost expression, the thing that moved near his mouth and did not quite arrive. Uncommon, he said, she thought. That is not what you were going to say. She did not say it. They sat in the small east sitting room while the rain came against the windows and the house around them slept, and after a time the conversation moved to other things, the state of the north field, which he described with the specific knowledge of someone who had walked it, the late spring, which had made everything in the gardens somewhat uncertain, a book she had been reading that sat on the table between them and which he had recognized at a glance. They talked about the book for a long time. She disagreed with his reading of the 3rd chapter and said so. He listened to her objection with the genuine attention of a man who finds disagreement interesting rather than threatening, and modified his position in a way that was not capitulation but incorporation. She had not had a conversation of this quality in 14 months. She had perhaps not had one in longer than that. When the rain lightened at 7:30, she became aware of the house beginning to stir around them and stood. Tomorrow, he said. She looked at him. The terrace, he said. If the weather holds. If it holds, she agreed. She left the sitting room and went upstairs to dress properly for the day, and she did not think about the conversation for the rest of the morning. She thought about it for the entire rest of the morning. The weather held. The next 3 mornings were clear and cold and absolutely reliable, and they were on the terrace for all of them, at their respective ends, with the 15 feet of balustrade between them. But the 15 feet felt different now. It had been, at the beginning, a neutral distance. It had become something with more intention in it, not closing but acknowledged, not changing but known. They talked more, not much more. The economy of their exchanges remained, but more. She learned that he had traveled considerably and described it with the specific unshowiness of someone who has been to enough places that they no longer feel the need to be impressive about it. She learned that he had been at Stoneleigh Court once before, years ago, under circumstances he mentioned briefly and did not elaborate on. She learned that he had read most of the books in the Stoneleigh library. She could tell by the way he referenced them, the offhand familiarity, the specific recall, and had opinions about the organization of the shelves. They are organized chronologically, she said, on the third morning, which makes very little sense. No, he agreed. Subject, then author, then date. The date tells you almost nothing on its own. Someone organized them chronologically because that is the most defensible system to someone who does not actually use the library. Exactly. She looked at him. You have thought about this before. I have several libraries, he said, and then stopped, with the specific quality of a man who has said something he did not intend to say. I have several libraries, not I know several libraries, not I have used several libraries. She looked at the park. She said nothing. She filed it alongside the hands and the bearing and the silences and the 2 cups of tea and the question he had asked Mottram about which ladies rose early. I have several libraries. She was beginning to assemble something. She did not yet know what shape it would take. The trouble with Lady Maud arrived, as it generally did, without warning and in the form of a luncheon conversation. Lord Pemberton has written, Lady Maud said, serving herself from the soup tureen with the deliberate care of a woman who considers all of her actions to be performances of correct behavior. He is to pass through Yorkshire at the end of the month and wishes to call. How lovely, said Georgiana, in the tone of someone who has learned to be enthusiastic about luncheon announcements on the grounds that enthusiasm is easier to maintain than resistance. He specifically mentioned, Lady Maud continued, looking not at Georgiana but at Cecily, that he recalled meeting you at the Hartley ball last autumn. He found you, a brief pause in which Lady Maud visibly selected the most useful framing, charming. Cecily set down her spoon. That is kind of him. Lord Pemberton is 63, Lady Maud said, with the precision of a woman delivering useful information rather than a verdict, and his second wife died in February. He has a substantial estate in Derbyshire and a house in Bath, and no particular need for anything except sensible management and intelligent company. The table was very quiet. Even Georgiana had stopped performing enthusiasm. Aunt Maud, Cecily said. You are 23, Lady Maud said. It is not an unreasonable age at which to consider one's position, and Lord Pemberton is 63 and recently widowed and in need of management. Cecily kept her voice entirely level. She had been keeping her voice level in response to her aunt for 3 years, and she was very good at it. I understand the arithmetic. Then you understand also that it is a significant opportunity for someone in your situation. I understand what you consider it to be, Cecily said. Lady Maud looked at her with the expression she kept for moments when Cecily declined to be appropriately grateful, not angry, precisely, but with the specific quality of disappointment that is designed to produce guilt in the recipient. I am trying, she said, to provide for you. I know, said Cecily. Thank you. She finished her luncheon in silence. So did Georgiana. Lady Maud talked about Lord Pemberton's estate. Afterward, in the corridor outside the dining room, Georgiana touched her arm. She means well, Georgiana said, which was what Georgiana said when she could not say anything that was actually true. I know she does, said Cecily. It does not help much, but I know. She did not go to the terrace the next morning. She lay awake before 5 and listened to the birds beginning in the elm trees and thought about Lord Pemberton, 63, recently widowed, and the Derbyshire estate and the Bath house, and the sensible management, and the fact that what her aunt was offering her was, in its own terms, a solution, not the solution she would have chosen, but a solution, which was something that her situation had been providing very little of. She thought about the terrace and the 15 feet of balustrade, and most people don't, and I have several libraries, and 2 cups of tea placed with a precision that was either accident or intention, And she thought, this is the kind of thinking that leads women in my position to ruin themselves for something that was never going to be what they thought it was. She stayed in bed until 6. Then she got up and went to the library and read, and did not think about the terrace or the man at the western end of it, or the shape of the thing she had been assembling and was not yet willing to complete. At 7:30 she heard a step in the corridor outside the library. It stopped. After a moment it moved on. She turned a page of her book and read the same paragraph 4 times without retaining any of it. She missed a second morning, and a third. On the 4th morning of her absence she was in the library at 5:30, which was earlier than she usually came to the library, and later than she usually came to the terrace, and she was telling herself that this was a coincidence of timing rather than a position, when the door opened and he came in. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up from her book. He looked, she thought, like a man who had decided to come here without quite deciding to come here, who had been passing and had found himself at the door and had opened it before the more careful part of his mind could intervene. His expression did something complicated in the space of a breath and then settled back into its usual management. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know you were here." "I often am," she said, "in the mornings." "Yes." A pause. "You haven't been on the terrace." She looked at her book. "No." I wondered if something was wrong. She set the book down. She looked at him across the library, across the long table with the globe at its center and the shelves rising on both sides to the ceiling, and she thought, I am going to say something honest. I am going to say it because I am tired and because the alternative is to keep pretending I am reading this book. My aunt has introduced a potential arrangement, she said. Lord Pemberton. Perhaps you've heard of him. Something moved in his face. I know the name. He is coming at the end of the month. She kept her voice level. My aunt believes it would be a significant opportunity for someone in my situation. He came into the library properly then, not to the table, but to the shelves along the east wall, where he stopped with his back to her and appeared to read the spines of books he was not reading. And do you believe it? He said. I believe it is a solution, she said. I am less certain it is the right one. What makes it wrong? She was quiet for a moment. He is 63, she said, and I am 23, and I would be providing sensible management and intelligent company for a man I met once at a ball, because the alternative is to continue providing them for my aunt indefinitely, which is also not what I would choose. She paused. It is a choice between two arrangements, neither of which I want. The question is which I can bear. He turned from the shelves. He looked at her with the expression she had seen in the rain doorway, the one with less management than usual, the one that had more in it than she could fully read. Miss Vane, he said. Cecily. Her name in his mouth was different from her name in other mouths. She noticed this and told herself not to notice it. Yes, she said, I have something to tell you. He moved to the table. He did not sit. He put his hands on the back of a chair and looked at her, and something in his bearing had changed. The settled quality was still there, but underneath it was a tension she had not seen before, the tension of a man who has decided to say a thing and is now committed to saying it. It is something I should have told you before now. I had reasons for waiting that seemed sufficient at the time and seem less so at present. She was very still. My name, he said, is not Ashton. The library was very quiet. Outside, the birds had started in the elms. No, she said, after a moment. My name is James Calder. He held her gaze. The Duke of Ravenshaw. She looked at him. She looked at him for quite a long time. The Duke of Ravenshaw, she said, owns the estate whose boundary runs along Stoneleigh's north field. Yes, the Duke of Ravenshaw is the reason the boundary assessment is happening at all. Yes. The Duke of Ravenshaw, she said, carefully, is not a man who would typically be sent to assess his own boundaries. He would send someone. He would, James Calder said. He has done so before. The results are incomplete. When you are a duke, the information you receive is always filtered through what people assume you want to hear. Pause. I have found it useful, over the years, to see things myself as someone else. as someone else. She sat with this. She looked at the table between them, at the globe at its center, at the books around them on their chronological shelves that made no sense to anyone who actually used a library. "You came to Stoneleigh Court," she said, disguised. "Yes. How long have you been doing this? Coming to places as someone else?" He looked at the globe. "Some years, since I understood that the title makes it nearly impossible to—" He stopped. "That most interactions, when people know who I am, are not about me. They are about the title, and the estate, and the fortune, and the various things that a title and an estate and a fortune represent to people who have none of them." He looked at her. "I found it increasingly difficult to determine what was real." "And so," she said, "you came to Stoneleigh Court as Mr. Ashton and stood on the terrace at 5 in the morning and drank tea and spoke about herons." "Yes, and found something real." The silence before his answer was the longest she had yet experienced with him. The birds outside had gathered themselves into full morning chorus. The light coming through the library windows was the particular gold of early summer, the kind that makes ordinary rooms look, briefly, like places where significant things might happen. "Yes," he said. She stood up. This was not a dramatic gesture. She was not a dramatic woman. But she stood, and the standing had a quality of needing space, of requiring the additional height and mobility that sitting did not allow. "I see," she said. "I am sorry," he said. "You should have told me sooner," she said, the level voice, the absolute level voice, which was doing a great deal of work at this moment. "Yes, I intended to." He remained at the chair, still with his hands on its back, still not sitting. There were reasons I delayed, reasons that made sense at the time." "Hobin, what reasons?" He was quiet. "Mr. Calder." She caught herself. "Your Grace, what reasons?" Something moved across his expression at the title, brief, like a wince that had been controlled before it could fully arrive. "I was not certain," he said, "what the information would do to the mornings." She looked at him. "I was not certain," he continued, "whether, if you knew who I was, the terrace would remain what it had been." He looked at the globe. "Every other place I have gone as myself. The information changes the room, changes how people look at me, changes what they say and what they withhold and what they perform." He looked back at her. The terrace had not been changed by anything. I was not ready to risk it. She walked to the window. She stood at it and looked out at the north field, at the boundary he had been walking for 11 days under a name that was not his, and she felt, clearly and precisely as she felt most things, a sequence of things she would need to work through in order. The first thing was anger, not the hot anger that produces scenes, which she had never been much given to, but the colder anger of a woman who has extended a specific kind of trust, the trust of someone who does not extend trust easily, and has found that the person receiving it was operating under conditions she did not know about. The second thing was, underneath the anger, a recognition. She understood, in a way she had not allowed herself to understand until this moment, exactly what the mornings had been. She understood it because he had just described the problem she had also been solving, from the other side, the problem of a person whose interactions are always filtered through other people's perception of their position. The Duke with his title. The poor relation with her poverty. Both of them, on the terrace, had been managing a version of the same problem. This did not dissolve the anger, but it complicated it. The third thing was that he had come this morning. He had not gone to the terrace and found her absent and let the absence stand. He had come to find her, which meant the 4 mornings of her not being on the terrace had produced, in him, the same thing that his absence, if it had occurred, would have produced in her. This was the most difficult thing to sit with. She turned from the window. "The information," she said, "does change things, I know. Not in the way you feared." She looked at him steadily. "I am not going to suddenly perform toward you the way other people perform. I find I have very little capacity for it at this hour of the morning." A pause. "But you are a duke, and I am a poor relation of your neighbor, and those are material facts that the 15 feet of balustrade could not actually change, whatever it felt like." "No," he said. They are material facts, and you knew them all along. Yes, and I did not. No. A pause. That was not fair to you. It was not. She kept her voice level. It placed me at a disadvantage I did not know I was at. He looked at her with the full quality of his attention, more open than she had seen it, more at risk than she had seen it, and said, I know. I am sorry. Not in the form that asks you to make it easy for me. Simply, I am sorry. What I did was not fair, and I knew it was not fair, and I continued anyway, because I was afraid of losing something I had not been prepared to find. She looked at him. She thought about 11 mornings, about the heron and the mist and the way he had said most people don't, and the 2 cups of tea and I have several libraries, and the 40 minutes in the east sitting room, and the rain on the windows, and the way the conversation had moved through the book's 3rd chapter, with the ease of 2 people who were thinking together rather than performing thought for each other. She thought. I was not prepared to find it either. She did not say this. I need to think, she said, about what this means, about what the shape of it is now that I have all the information. Of course. I would like you to give me today. Yes, tomorrow morning, she said. I will be on the terrace. Something in his face, the smallest easing of something that had been held very tightly. I'll be there, he said. She walked out of the library. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands and thought, very carefully, about what she was going to do. She thought about it for the entire day. She thought about it while she read to Lady Maud after luncheon, a chapter of the novel Lady Maud had been making her way through for 3 weeks, and which was, Cecily had assessed, at least 200 pages longer than its story required. She thought about it while she sat in the garden with Georgiana in the late afternoon, watching Georgiana attempt a watercolor of the south lawn with more enthusiasm than precision. She thought about it at dinner, where Mr. Ashton, where James Calder, the Duke of Ravenshaw, was absent, having sent his apologies via the footman, and where Lady Maud expressed carefully calibrated regret, and Georgiana looked at Cecily with the specific look of someone who knows something and is choosing not to deploy it. What she was thinking about was this, the shape of the thing, now that she had all the available pieces. She had assembled them over the course of the afternoon with the same methodical care she brought to everything, laying them out in order, examining each one, determining what it meant and what it did not mean, and what she was prepared to do with it. Piece 1. He had come to Stoneleigh Court under a false name and had maintained that name for the duration of his stay, which was the behavior of a man either deceiving everyone or protecting something, and she had spent enough time in the mornings with him to be confident it was the latter. Piece 2. He had asked Mottram which ladies of the house rose early. He had done this 2 days into his stay, which meant within 2 days of their first morning on the terrace. She thought about the precision of the 2 cups of tea. She thought about I couldn't sleep, said on the morning he had arrived before her. She thought about the morning she had stayed away, and the step in the corridor outside the library, and the 4 mornings of her absence before he had come to find her. Piece 3. He was the Duke of Ravenshaw. The Duke of Ravenshaw was, she thought about this with the specific clarity of a woman who has been managing her own financial reality for 4 years. A man of considerable means. The estate on the north side of Stoneleigh's boundary was the largest in the county. The title was one of the oldest in England. Lord Pemberton, 63 and recently widowed, was by any material measure significantly outmatched. She sat with piece 3 for a long time, because piece 3 was the piece that made her most uncomfortable. She was uncomfortable with it because she did not want her decision to be about piece 3. She wanted her decision to be about 11 mornings and herons and the cold tea in the east sitting room and a man who had found her exactness uncommon and had meant it as the highest thing he could say. She wanted it to be about what was real, which was what he had come to Stoneleigh Court looking for, and which she had also been looking for, without knowing she was looking, for longer than she was comfortable admitting. But piece 3 was part of the truth, and she was not someone who could ignore a part of the truth simply because it was inconvenient. So she sat with it. She sat with it and she thought, if he were Mr. Ashton, actually Mr. Ashton, the boundary assessor, a man of ordinary means and ordinary prospects, would the decision be different? She thought about the terrace and the 15 feet and the books and the 40 minutes in the east sitting room. She thought, no. The answer arrived simply, without drama, as answers do when you have been honest enough with yourself to deserve them. No. If he were actually Mr. Ashton, the decision would be the same. The 11 mornings would be the same. What they had built in the 15 feet of silence and the careful exchange of small, true things would be the same. The fact that he was James Calder, Duke of Ravenshaw, changed the material conditions considerably, and the essential question not at all. The essential question was, did she trust the mornings? She thought about his face in the library, the most unguarded she had seen it. The specific quality of a man who has arrived at the end of his capacity for careful management and is standing in the ruins of it with nothing to offer but the plain thing. I was afraid of losing something I had not been prepared to find. She had been afraid of the same thing. She admitted to herself in the privacy of her room at 10:30 at night, been afraid of it since the morning he had not been there first, and she had understood, in the quality of her relief when he appeared, that she had been hoping he would. She had been afraid of it, and she had managed the fear by not examining it, by treating the mornings as a fixed condition rather than a choice, by telling herself that a woman in her position could not afford to assign meaning to 15 feet of balustrade and 2 cups of tea. She had been wrong about that. She lay down and looked at the ceiling and thought, tomorrow morning I will be on the terrace. She slept better than she had in a week. Georgiana was waiting for her in the corridor at 4:30. This was startling enough that Cecily stopped walking entirely. Georgiana was not, under any ordinary circumstances, awake at 4:30. Georgiana was not, under most extraordinary circumstances, awake at 4:30. She was standing in the corridor in her dressing gown, with her copper hair loose and her green eyes entirely alert, which meant she had not been to sleep at all, or had woken and decided the hour was worthwhile. Go, Georgiana said. I'll manage Mama. Cecily looked at her. He's a duke, Georgiana said. I have now known this for approximately 6 hours, which I spent not sleeping, and I have used that time to determine that Mama will manage the information in whichever way is most advantageous, and that the most advantageous version is the one where you are on the terrace at 5 o'clock. She folded her arms. Go, Cecily said. Georgiana. I know, Georgiana said. We don't have to talk about it. Just go. Cecily went. He was there. Of course he was there. She had told him she would be, and she had said it in the tone she used when she meant something without qualification, and he had learned, over 11 mornings, to hear the difference. But she felt, stepping onto the terrace in the early dark, the specific quality of relief that she had been managing and not examining, and was now allowing to be what it was. He was at the western end. She went to the eastern. The air was cold and very clear, and the sky to the east was doing what it did in that last half hour before dawn, the specific dark that is darker than ordinary night, the dark that knows it is the last dark, that has the quality of a held breath before the change. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, I thought about it all day. I thought about it all day also, he said. I thought about the 11 mornings. She looked at the sky. I thought about what they were and what they would have been if I had known who you were from the beginning, whether they would have been the same. And I don't think they would have been. She kept her voice level and honest, which was the only way she knew how to say important things. Not because I would have valued them less, but because I would have been more careful. I would have managed myself differently. The 15 feet would have been a different kind of 15 feet. He was quiet. I would not have told you about Lord Pemberton, she said, or about what it means to be a poor relation and what it does to one's relationship with pretense. I would not have said the things I said in the East sitting room, because I would have been performing toward your title rather than thinking alongside your mind. She paused. So in that sense, you were right that knowing would change it. It would have. And now, he said, now I know. She looked at the sky, which was beginning to do something at the eastern edge, the very first intimation of light, so faint it was barely a color, barely a direction, more of a suggestion that color might be possible. And the question is whether what we built in the not knowing can survive the knowing. Can it? Wilt? She looked at him across the 15 feet of balustrade that was the 15 feet she knew, the one that had been built morning by morning out of small true things, and she thought, yes, I am angry with you, she said. I want to be clear about that. The deception was not fair, and it put me at a disadvantage I did not have the information to protect myself from, and I am going to be angry about it for some time. Yes, he said, that is fair. And I also, she stopped. She felt the thing she was about to say arrive at the surface of her and hover there, requiring her to choose it. I also understand why you did it. I understand the specific problem you were solving. I have been solving a version of the same problem from the other side of it, and I know what it feels like to perform constantly toward other people's perceptions of your position, and to want, very much, a place where you don't have to. He was very still. The terrace, she said, was that place, for both of us. Yes, he said. The word came out slightly less managed than usual. Yes, it was. She looked at the eastern sky, which was now unmistakably lighter, not light yet, but committed to becoming it, the dark giving way with the slow inevitability of things that were always going to happen. I need you to understand something, she said, about what I will and will not accept going forward. Tell me. I will not be managed, she said. I will not be a variable in someone else's calculations that I don't know about. I will not be at a disadvantage because someone has determined that the disadvantage is in their interests and not mine. She looked at him. I have been in that position for 4 years and I am finished with it. Yes, he said. You should be finished with it. If there are things you cannot tell me yet, she said, I need you to tell me that there are things you cannot tell me yet. Not to simply omit them and allow me to proceed on insufficient information. Yes. And I need the plain answer, she said, when the time comes for the plain answer. Not a managed version of it, not a careful version, the plain one. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his most real face, the one with the least distance in it, the one that appeared when he had used up his careful management and had nothing left but the thing itself. Then here is the plain answer, he said, without managing it. He held her gaze. I came to Stoneleigh Court to assess a boundary. I came as someone else because it was the only methodology I had found that produced something real. I found you on the first morning, quite by accident, and I asked Mottram about the early risers before I had fully understood why I was asking, and I placed a cup of tea at your end of the balustrade because it seemed the most direct possible way to say something I did not yet have words for. She was very still. I rose earlier, he said, every morning, not because I could not sleep, because an hour that had been nothing in particular became the hour I was organizing the rest of the day around. A pause. And when you were not there for 4 mornings, I understood, with a clarity that was somewhat inconvenient, that I had made a fundamental error in judgment about my own priorities. She looked at him. The light was coming in properly now. The east was pale gold above the elm trees, the sky lightening by degrees, the park emerging from the dark in the slow revelation of things that have been there all along and are simply now visible. You are a duke, she said, and I am a poor relation. You are Cecily Vane, he said, who is exact and direct and reads books for the meaning rather than the performance, and who has the specific quality of attention that most people lose somewhere between childhood and adulthood. And I have been looking for, he stopped. I have spent some years looking for exactly this, without being certain it existed. She looked at the light coming over the elm trees. She felt, in her chest, the accumulated weight of 11 mornings and 1 day of thinking, and one Georgiana in a corridor at 4:30 who had managed their respective mothers so that she could be here. I am still angry with you, she said. I know. The almost expression, the shadow of the actual one. I expect you will continue to be, for some time. Yes. She looked at him. I am also, she stopped. Also, he said. Glad, she said. I am also glad that you came to Stoneleigh Court, that you asked Mottram, that you put the cup at my end of the balustrade. A pause. I am glad for the 11 mornings. I would not trade them for a version of this where I had known from the beginning. He held very still, in the way of someone who has been given something they were not certain they had the right to expect. Then so am I, he said, for whatever that is worth. It is worth something, she said. I haven't decided how much yet. The ghost of the actual smile. She had seen it twice before, and both times it had arrived and departed before she could fully account for it. But it was there. That is fair, he said. She looked back at the park. The heron was at the ornamental pond. She could see it from this distance, the grey shape standing motionless at the water's edge with its improbable patience. He's back, she said. He looked. Later than usual. He comes when he comes. She looked at the heron. He does not consult us about the timing. A pause. No, he said. He doesn't. They stood at the balustrade in the morning light, at their respective ends, and watched the heron stand at the water, and the light come fully over the elms, and the park emerge from the last of the night, and they said very little, because the hour did not require it, and they had both understood from the beginning that this was one of its most essential qualities. Lady Maud made of it, as Georgiana had predicted, exactly what was most advantageous. She received the information about Mr. Ashton's actual identity with the expression of a woman rearranging a room she thought she knew, not distress at the rearrangement, but the specific focus of someone who understands that the room is better than she had realized and intends to proceed accordingly. She did not acknowledge that she had placed Cecily at luncheon in the context of Lord Pemberton's visit, without being aware that there was a Duke of Ravenshaw on the terrace at 5 in the morning. She did not acknowledge that there was any awkwardness in the gap between what she had known and what had been true. She simply revised. His Grace the Duke of Ravenshaw, she said, at dinner that evening, which was the first dinner at which James Calder appeared under his correct name and correct title, has been a most considerate guest. He has, Cecily said. The Ravenshaw estate, Lady Maud continued, looking not at James Calder, but at the middle distance of the dining room, which was her usual approach to observations she wanted heard without being attributed, is the finest in the county, perhaps in the north of England. I wouldn't go that far, James said, from his end of the table. He had, Cecily thought, a particularly good face for receiving Lady Maud, the composed surface, the faint quality of knowing exactly what was happening, the absolute refusal to perform embarrassment. You are modest, Your Grace. I am accurate, he said. He looked at Cecily. She looked at her plate. Georgiana, who was performing the face of someone who is not paying particular attention and doing it very badly, said, Cecily tells me the roses along the south wall are at their best this week. Tomorrow morning, Cecily said, before Lady Maud could speak, might be a good time to look at them. This was directed, precisely, at James Calder. He did not smile. He looked at his wine. I expect so, he said, if the weather holds. It should, she said. The sky was clear this evening. Lady Maud looked between them with the expression of a woman reading a text she has not been given sufficient context to fully interpret, and deciding that the interpretation could wait. Yes, she said. The roses are always best in the morning light. After dinner, in the corridor, Georgiana pulled her aside. You are going to make him suffer a little, Georgiana said, aren't you? I am going to take an appropriate amount of time, Cecily said, to determine what is right, which is different from suffering. It is structured uncertainty, Cecily said. I find it clarifying. Georgiana looked at her with the expression she kept for moments when she found Cecily genuinely funny, which she was usually too well bred to show. You are going to be absolutely terrifying to be married to, she said. I am going to be, Cecily said, with great precision, exactly what I am. Georgiana kissed her on the cheek, the second time in a week she had done this, which was more than in the previous 3 years combined, and went upstairs. Cecily stood in the corridor for a moment, alone. She thought about exactly what I am, and what that was, and what it had been, and what she was prepared to let it become. Then she went to bed, he proposed on the terrace. She had not expected this, not the location, not the timing, not the manner of it, which was nothing like the proposals she had read about or heard described. There was no bending of the knee, there was no speech. There was the terrace, and the usual hour, and the light coming in from the east, the way it always did, and the heron at the pond, and his voice from the western end of the balustrade saying, very simply, "I would like to ask you something," before you've had time to think about it too much. She had looked at him, across the 15 feet that had become the most familiar 15 feet in her experience. "I am always thinking," she said. "I know." The almost smile. "Ask me something first, then." So we are even. She had considered this. "Why the terrace?" she said. "That first morning, you could have gone anywhere. I saw the light," he said, "from my window, the way it hit the east end of the balustrade before anything else. I thought," he stopped. "I thought, whoever has found this already is someone worth knowing." She looked at the place where the light always arrived first, on the wide stone at the eastern end, where she had stood every morning for 6 weeks. "Your turn," she said. He had asked her. Plainly and simply, with no management in it, the plain version, as she had requested, the one without the careful architecture. He had asked her whether she would come to Ravenshaw, not as a managed answer to her material situation, not as a solution to the problem of Lord Pemberton and Derbyshire estates, and sensible management, but because the mornings had become the hour he organized the rest of the day around, and he intended to spend a very long time organizing days, and he would like to do it alongside the person who had shown him what the terrace looked like when it was genuinely used. She had stood with this. She had looked at him across the familiar 15 feet and thought about what she was, what she had been, what she was choosing. She was Cecily Vane, who was exact and direct, and had learned to make herself useful in rooms that had not been arranged for her, and who had found over 11 mornings and a great deal of cold tea and one afternoon of rain against east-facing windows. That useful was not the only thing she was. She was also the person who had stood at the eastern end of the balustrade first, before anyone arrived, and had found something worth finding, a light that hit the stone before anything else in the park was touched by it, hour that was entirely hers, a silence that had room in it for another person without losing what it was. "Yes," she said. Not the yes of a woman accepting an arrangement, the yes of a woman who has thought about it all the way down and found, at the bottom of the thinking, that the answer was the same it would have been on the first morning, if she had known then what she knew now. Simply, yes. The morning after they were engaged, she was on the terrace at 5, as she always was. The sky was doing its last dark thing, the held breath before the change, and the air was cold and clean, and she had brought her own cup of tea, and stood at the eastern end of the balustrade, and looked at the park. The terrace door opened. He was earlier than usual. He came to his end of the balustrade, the western end, the one that was his, and looked out at the park. "The heron is late," he said. "He comes when he comes," she said. "He does not consult us." "No." A pause. "He never has." The light began at the east end of the sky, where it always began, moving down through the elm trees in the slow advance that had something inevitable about it. The rooks made their morning complaint. The heron appeared at the pond, silently, as though it had always been standing there and had simply become visible. She looked at the park. He looked at the park. Between them the 15 feet of balustrade held the silence it had always held, full rather than empty, a distance that was known rather than neutral, she thought. "This is what I was looking for, without knowing I was looking," she thought. Not the title, not the estate, not the resolution of the problem that had been her material life for 4 years. This, the specific quality of a morning shared with someone who understood that the hour was worth getting up for, that the silence was worth keeping, that some things needed neither performance nor explanation, only the patience to be present for them, in the earliest light, before the rest of the day arrived to claim everything else. "James," she said. "Yes, thank you. For coming to Stoneleigh Court." A pause. "Thank you," he said, "for being on the terrace." She looked at the light coming over the elms and she thought, "I will be on the terrace tomorrow, and the morning after, and the morning after that." And now, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she would not be on it alone. A Regency romance of hidden identity. 11 mornings before the house woke, and the kind of love that begins in the only hour that was entirely your own, and becomes, in the end, the hour you are no longer willing to spend on anything less.